History as it happens, March 14th, 2024. Netanyahu's war.
If self-determination were, as they now say, the core of the conflict, they could have easily established a Palestinian state then, but they didn't. The fact that they're terrorists and the fact that they seek our destruction, I don't think they're a partner to negotiation.
Let me first of all say I'm delighted to have the Prime Minister here. I've looked forward to having a chance to...
I'm confident that we can overcome the hurdles that face us and continue with a genuine process of seeking peace. We seek peace with our neighbors, with all of them. And we are prepared to fulfill all of our obligations, providing the Palestinians keep their obligations.
That Israel withdrawing territory exposes itself to more danger is something he feels in his heart.
Israel wants peace. I want peace.
Has not offered any kind of viable alternative that would achieve the same verifiable.
Our security and the prospects of peace in the Middle East depend on one thing: total victory over Hamas.
From the moment he entered public life, Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to protect Israel's security in a hostile neighborhood. Now 74 years old and clinging to power, Israel's prime minister is prosecuting a war of immense destruction that seems unlikely to lead to a lasting peace that he has often said is his aim. Netanyahu through the decades. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Hamas will regroup, rearm, and reconquer Gaza. And then we're back to square one. And that's an intolerable threat that we cannot accept.
So Israelis are holding their prime minister accountable for this series of failures. And this is not only the Israelis who went to the streets to demonstrate against Netanyahu in the year before on judicial overhaul and democratic backsliding. These are some from his own political camp. So between 70 and 80% of Israelis, that is a huge majority, wants to see new leadership.
Benjamin Netanyahu was born in 1949 in Tel Aviv, the year after the birth of his state.
In New York City in May of '48, American Jewry joins the freedom-loving peoples of the world to celebrate the thrilling news. United Nations laws have established Palestine as a free and independent state, to be known as Israel. And there's one bold star.
Well, after spending a good part of his childhood in the United States, he returned to Israel in 1967 to fight in war. And after serving in the Yom Kippur War, he returned to the U.S. to complete his education. In 1978, now 28 years old and known as Benjamin Netai, N-I-T-A-Y, he appeared on a television debate show in Boston where he was asked about an issue that would define his future political career: coexistence with the Palestinians.
Mr. Netai is a graduate of MIT. He is an Israeli, and he is a man who has written widely on this question before the House tonight. Mr. Netai, is the issue of self-determination the core of the conflict in the Middle East?
No, I don't believe it is. The real core of the conflict is the unfortunate Arab refusal to accept the state of Israel. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, for 20 years the Arabs had both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And if self-determination were, as they now say, the core of the conflict, they could have easily established a Palestinian state then, but they didn't.
When did the issue arise then?
Well, for 20 years, we didn't hear a word about self-determination. And in fact, what we did hear, those of us living in the Middle East, was about driving the Jews into the sea.
It's amazing, isn't it, how his voice has hardly changed? Well, for the next 46 years after that TV appearance, all the way to present day, whether as a diplomat, prime minister, or member of the opposition, Benjamin Netanyahu's paramount concern has been Israel's security. He has opposed ceding land occupied by Israel since 1967, and he has opposed Palestinian statehood. He has sat face-to-face with many American presidents going back to the mid-1990s.
This is the most genteel press of all, the Israeli press. They're all pussycats here.
Let me first of all say I'm delighted to have the Prime Minister here. I've looked forward to having a chance to have this conversation. He and his family arrived late.
It was that campaign before the 1996 election that still haunts Netanyahu's image, when he raged against the government of Yitzhak Rabin for seeking peace with the Palestinians in the Oslo process. At a rally in 1995, he said the government of Israel is bowing down to the murderer Yasser Arafat. We are here, for we will never allow Jerusalem to be divided, he said. As Netanyahu spoke, the crowd chanted, "Rabin is a traitor. In blood and fire, we will get rid of Rabin." Posters showed Rabin dressed as a Nazi. Netanyahu did not condemn any of this, embraced as it was by extremist elements in Israel who viewed any compromise over land as treasonous. About a month after this rally, Rabin spoke at a rally of his own in early November 1995. And as the rally ended and Israel's prime minister departed, a Jewish religious fanatic named Yigal Amir gunned him down and may have killed the peace process too.
The world has lost one of its greatest men, a warrior for his nation's freedom, and now a martyr for his nation's peace.
As William Cleveland writes in A History of the Modern Middle East, Yigal Amir and other like-minded Israelis were not the only individuals who sought to destroy the peace process. During the interval between Rabin's assassination and the Israeli elections of May 1996, Hamas carried out another round of suicide bombings in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv that caused public opinion to shift away from support for the peace process. The Israeli government responded with a demonstration of its dominance over Palestinians, sealing off the occupied territories, placing many West Bank towns under curfew, and causing increased economic distress within the Palestinian community. This crackdown, in turn, fed the atmosphere of hopelessness and despair among the Palestinians and led more and more of them to turn away from Arafat and the unsatisfactory status quo that he represented. Cleveland goes on to write, Yigal Amir's bullets and the bombs of Hamas had, it seemed, achieved their intended results. Netanyahu formed a coalition government that has been called one of the most conservative and religiously oriented in the history of Israel. It was also one of the most inept. During its first 2.5 years in office, it lurched from one self-induced crisis to another, barely managing to survive. Again, that is William Cleveland in A History of the Modern Middle East. Today, Benjamin Netanyahu is in his third stint as prime minister, dogged by corruption charges at the head of the most right-wing government in Israel's history, and prosecuting a war in Gaza that has killed so many civilians and left so many starving that even President Biden is now warning Netanyahu not to go forward with an assault on the city of Rafah. Netanyahu ignored him. This is from a couple days ago.
We must destroy the remaining Hamas battalions in Rafah. If not, Hamas will regroup, rearm, and reconquer Gaza. And then we're back to square one. And that's an intolerable threat that we cannot accept. We will finish the job in Rafah while enabling the civilian population to get out of harm's way. We've taken measures to minimize civilian casualties that no other army has taken in history.
Persist as he might in trying to destroy Hamas, Netanyahu's legacy is in tatters. He promised Israeli security and settlements while keeping the Palestinian leadership divided, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, 2 million Palestinian people imprisoned in the Gaza Strip, where the IDF would have to occasionally mow the grass, as the security strategy was known before October 7th. Well, 5 months into this war, Hamas is still holding Israeli hostages. Palestinians are homeless and hungry. And there's no clear idea of what will come after the war, who might rebuild the destroyed enclave. Political scientist Nimrod Goren is the senior fellow for Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. He's been following Netanyahu's career from the start. Nimrod Goren, welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Joining us from Israel. And before we get to Netanyahu's very long career, let's start by talking about what's happening right now in Gaza. What is the end game here? Because many analysts don't think it's possible to destroy Hamas entirely.
There are the official war objectives that the Israeli leadership put forth at the beginning of the war, and this goes beyond Netanyahu, and these are objectives that, generally speaking, the Israeli public is supportive of. and there was the objective of releasing the Israeli hostages kidnapped by Hamas, and the one about dismantling Hamas military power, and about ensuring that Hamas does not continue to control Gaza politically wise. Those objectives are overall agreed upon within Israel. The way in which the military conduct is taking place, the civilian price, the humanitarian issue, this is increasingly being debated within the Israeli society. It took some time for that to happen because initially Israel was very much inward looking up after the horrible things that happens on October 7 and the impact of that on almost everyone in the society. Plus, there is a concern that Netanyahu is too much focused on his own political survival, and therefore his plans for the future of the war do not necessarily align with the strategic interest of Israel and its national security.
And there are some who are calling for elections sooner rather than later. I think the next elections are for 2025 or 2026. Yeah, so at least, that's 2 years from now. Is there any chance there'll be early elections?
I think there is. I think what happened in October 7 was the largest failure that Israel suffered surely since 1973. It was the most deadliest day in Israel's history. It was such a colossal failure from almost every aspect you look at it. Whatever happened in the years before, whatever happened during the day itself, and whatever happened since in terms of the leadership and what Netanyahu projected. So Israelis are holding their prime minister accountable for this series of failures. And this is not only the Israelis who went to the streets to demonstrate against Netanyahu in the year before on judicial overhaul and democratic backsliding. These are some from his own political camp. So between 70 and 80% of Israelis, that is a huge majority, wants to see new leadership, want to see new elections. There are different positions on when those should take place, who the next leader should be. It does not necessarily reflect a change of ideologies from what Netanyahu represented, but in terms of the persona that is heading and leading Israel, the public lost faith in Netanyahu.
Before all this happened, there were a number of elections in Israel that seemed to lead to political paralysis. It was very difficult to form a lasting coalition. Any indication that it might be different next time around?
We had an experience before the current coalition that was a very unique one in Israeli politics, in which there was a government led by Naftali Bennett, who was a right-wing politician, still is, who led a small party, a very small party actually, but joined forces with centrist and even leftist parties for this grand coalition that caused ideological divides. That was the coming together of so many political actors who just wanted to see Netanyahu gone and wanted to see a government that takes better care of what the Israeli society and public needs. That didn't last for too long, and what replaced that was this current Netanyahu coalition, which is the most far-right coalition that Israel has ever had. It has partners in key positions that were illegitimate in the Israeli political discourse just a couple of years ago. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, those are now the allies of Netanyahu. So the goal of all those that do not want to see Netanyahu remain in power is basically to come back to the model that was before.
Okay.
Some sort of a coalition that includes different fractions of our society, that has responsible leadership, that has security orientation, that is not caring about their own personal agenda, but about the public good. And that's as good as you can get at the moment. So it's going back to this very diverse ideological coalition, which is not homogenic, but at least will see the benefit of the country as the most important thing for it to deal with.
But not necessarily a peace party or a coalition that would be open to negotiations with the Palestinians.
You will not see a peace party leading the coalition. The peace camp in Israel is currently, unfortunately, weak in terms of political power. But you do see an understanding in the Israeli public that the policies that were implemented towards the Palestinians by Netanyahu in the previous years did not work, and even failed and cast a big price on Israel, and you need a new approach. Now, Israelis are not necessarily clear on what this new approach should be, and most of them are not now advocating for a two-state solution, although it seems like the most feasible eventual resolution to the conflict. There's no appetite on doing that now, but having such a government like we had with Bennett and Lapid, a more moderate one, is one that can engage. It can engage with the Palestinians, it can engage with regional partners, it could somehow lead gradual steps that will bring the two-state solution closer, rather than what Netanyahu is doing, that is basically going after any chance of having a two-state solution in the future. So it's kind of a shift. It's not a total game changer, but in terms of the doors it opens for regional cooperation, I think that will be a major thing, especially in the reality when the war is finally over and the Middle East will be reshaping in a way.
Yeah, a lot of variables there. We don't know how long the war is going to last. We don't know if elections will be held now or in 2026. So we'll return to the current situation at the end of our conversation here, because if Netanyahu is anything, he is a survivor. So he was born in 1949, so he became the first Israeli prime minister to be born in the state of Israel post-1948 when he won the 1996 election. He spent a lot of time in the United States as a youth. He actually graduated high school in the U.S., in Philadelphia or thereabouts. And for a time, he seemed to be more interested in business and consulting than politics. What can you say about these formative years of Benjamin Netanyahu in the 1960s and early 1970s?
Yeah, on the face of it, it's a very different career path than what you used to see from Israeli leaders. Previous Israeli leaders were really involved in the country since its early days of establishment. The one that Netanyahu replaced in the prime minister office was Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres was basically the one leading Dimona and Israel's nuclear project, if such a project exists, according to all the reports. He was the one basically doing that. Netanyahu was doing his high school years in the States and was doing his business career over there. So the background is a very different one. But in a way, it was playing for his favor, because that was a time when Israel was just opening towards the international community. Israel in the early 90s, after the Oslo Accords, opened up to the region, became much more involved in the international community, much more accepted among different countries. And Netanyahu, coming from the U.S., the most significant ally for Israel, understanding American culture, knowing to speak the English with all those small nuances that American audiences like, that was something that Israelis liked in a way. And his transition from his growing up in the States and then moving into the diplomatic space, serving in Washington in the embassy, then serving as ambassador to the UN, gave him an added value when he came into Israeli politics, also reflecting a younger generation of politicians at a time when the governance system in Israel shifted from the traditional vote for a party to direct vote for a prime minister. When Netanyahu won the elections in 96, that was the first time that was implemented, and it really played into his favor.
He worked as a business consultant in the late 1970s, I believe, in Massachusetts, where he got to know Mitt Romney, the Boston Consulting Group. And as you say, he speaks perfect English, no accent at all. He's a master communicator. But maybe his first profession, and this is not unusual for an Israeli citizen, he was a soldier. He fought in the 1967 war, correct? And then again in 1973, he went to Israel to fight in the Yom Kippur War in the Special Forces. How did that shape his outlook?
First, it's something that is part of the Israeli rationale. You spend some time abroad, you study in a different place, but when your country is in crisis, the thing that you do is you pack up your bags and you come to serve at home. And Netanyahu did that twice, and I think that was part of his personal story. He did so in a very elite unit of the Israeli military. He has a personal story with his brother, who was also like a military hero and was then killed in one of the operations. So that all, again, was part of his political persona. By the way, very different than what we see now with the war, that Netanyahu's son, Yair, is basically in Miami and is not coming back to fight. So you see how his story changes, and so much criticism is now on Netanyahu and his family for how they treat the war, very differently than how Netanyahu, the young Netanyahu at the time, did so. So I think that that aspect of getting the security aspect of his leadership, of his profile, of his career path, that was a validator.
I didn't know that his son lived in Miami. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, he returned to Israel after working at the Boston Consulting Group to run the Jonathan Netanyahu Anti-Terror Institute, named after his brother who had been killed. Was Netanyahu a Zionist, or what kind of Zionist was he?
I think by all that you defined and described until now, it's very clear that he's a very deep Zionist in terms of his connection to Israel, his beliefs about the country. He grew up to a father who was very much involved in politics. His father was a professor, an historian, a very ideological one on the right wing, very engaged in politics, although not directly there, very much part of the public life. So I think the education, the messaging that came from his father to him kind of shaped his ideological view and continued to, by the way, throughout his career as a politician. His father was a very significant figure in that. So when Netanyahu comes back to Israel, I think he's already having a clear ideological mindset. He's utilizing this institute that you mentioned, that is a very small one-man show in a way, but gives him leeway into the right-wing political system and basically enables him to get his first political position later on, through the connections he made there.
So he believed that all the lands of biblical Israel belong to the modern Jewish state, that there is no room for a Palestinian state, or a very small one, if that.
At the time, the discussion on a Palestinian state did not really exist in the Israeli society. We're talking about the years even before the peace with Egypt in 1979. So there was not even a sense that you can reach peace with an Arab country, let alone with the Palestinian issue. So it was a very different framing at the time, but the position was a very hawkish one, I think, of Netanyahu, which was tradition kind of Likud at the time, very much focused on anti-terror. It's not only the name of the institute, it's the early books that he wrote, was all the time the fight against terror. That was how he framed his political messaging those years and even in his first years of political power.
Yeah, because during these years, the PLO also had a non-negotiating position when it came to Israel. Arafat's organization was trying to take back or destroy the Jewish state using terrorism. There was a lot of fighting. Even when there wasn't a major war going on, there was always a lot of fighting happening.
Yeah, so there was a lot of fighting and there was no peace process yet.
Yeah.
Okay, and only in 1980 did the PLO accept the UN resolutions and began to be a partner first for the U.S. administration, later on for the Israeli government.
Do we know what Netanyahu thought of the 1978 Camp David Accords that you alluded to, which were supposed to lead to the resolution of the Palestinian issue at some point? You know, whenever I read old newspaper clippings or listen to old news conferences, they sound like they could be happening today. You know, these issues never resolved, and the same language keeps coming up, peace process, etc. That aside, do we know what Netanyahu thought of the 78 Camp David Accords?
So he was not in a position to do political voting. He was out of politics at the time. The visit by Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and the peace agreement that was signed by Menachem Begin, signed by Likud, signed by the right-wing party, was basically supported by all. So I don't know what his position at the time was, but I can assume that he was supporting that. After all, he was appointed by Moshe Arens to the positions in Washington. By the way, the Palestinian component was not a significant one of the Israeli-Egypt treaty. So there was some agreement on a possible autonomy plan for the Palestinians, but that was mostly a face-saving component to enable Egypt to do a bilateral treaty with Israel. So I do not think that it was geared towards solving the Palestinian issue at the time, but it was mostly a way for Egypt to feel more comfortable with signing a peace treaty with Israel. By the way, it didn't work very well for Egypt. It was boycotted from the Arab League and from the Arab world for almost a decade afterwards.
The questions that have brought warfare and bitterness to the Middle East for the last 30 years will not be settled overnight. But we should all recognize the substantial achievements that have been made. One of the agreements that President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin are signing tonight is entitled A Framework for Peace in the Middle East. This framework concerns the principles and some specifics in the most substantive way, which will govern a comprehensive peace settlement. It deals specifically with the future of the West Bank and Gaza and the need to resolve the Palestinian problem in all its aspects. The framework document proposes a 5-year transitional period in the West Bank and Gaza, during which the Israeli military government will be withdrawn and a self-governing authority will be elected with full autonomy. It also provides for Israeli forces to remain in specified locations during this period to protect Israel's security. The Palestinians will have the right to participate in the determination of their own future in negotiations which will resolve the final status of the West Bank and Gaza, and then to produce an Israeli Jordanian peace treaty.
I'll share with you a passage from Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, page 136. Although under Carter, as we've been discussing here, the U.S. had come close to endorsing the Palestinians' national rights and their involvement in negotiations, the two sides found themselves farther apart than ever. Camp David and the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty signaled U.S. alignment with the most extreme expression of Israel's negation of Palestinian rights, an alignment that was consolidated by Ronald Reagan's administration. Begin and his successors in the Likud, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and then Benjamin Netanyahu, were implacably opposed to Palestinian statehood, sovereignty, or control of the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. They were the ideological heirs of Jabotinsky. They believe that the entirety of Palestine belongs solely to the Jewish people. Do you agree with that?
That was definitely the right-wing ideology, but if you look at the center-left ideology of the time, it wasn't that different. Okay, we need to remember that the settlement project basically began during the time of left-wing party government that was before Likud came to power, before Begin. So again, the issue of Palestinian sovereignty was not on the Israeli agenda those years. I think it was only in the beginning of the first Intifada, maybe in 1988 or late 80s, when King Hussein kind of said, Jordan does not want to control the West Bank anymore. We let the Palestinians handle that. Only then some discussion about sovereignty came into play. A discussion about actual Palestinian state, I think, did not happen in Israel until Ehud Barak comes to be prime minister in 1999 and the Camp David summit of 2000. So 20 years before that, that was a non-issue in the Israeli society. And the fear was still from the Arab countries neighboring Israel. Israelis was reminding of what happened in 73, the threat of a full-fledged war. And the opening with Egypt was very dramatic in terms of changing these calculations and reshaping the Israeli mindset.
Well, in that sense, nothing has changed in that the Palestinians don't seem to be the priority of anybody. I mean, that might be changing now after what's happening, right? I mean, you look at all these potential normalization deals. The Palestinian issue was not front and center in the negotiations, say, between the Saudis and Israel.
Yeah, but there was a period in between. So when we go from the peace with Egypt until what you see now with the Abraham Accords and normalization, there was a significant peace process happening in the 1990s. You know, after the Madrid conference in 91, where actually Netanyahu was one of the representatives sent by the government, that eventually jump-started the process that led to the Oslo Accords in 1993 between Israel and the PLO with mutual recognition at the time when Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister. And that decade of the 1990s showed that when Israel does move forward with the Palestinians, the regional gates are opening for it. And Israel signed a treaty with Jordan, and Israel had diplomatic representation in different Arab and Muslim countries, and Israel was widely accepted. That broke down in 2000 with the start of the Second Intifada after the collapse of the Camp David summit.
I did an entire episode about Oslo with your colleague at the Middle East Institute, Khaled El-Gindi. So another anecdote here about some of Netanyahu's early ideas or his early influence on politics. He was the deputy to Moshe Aarons, who was Israel's ambassador to the United States. And this is during or right after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Again, from Khalidi's book here. This is after the PLO military contingent had left Beirut at the end of August 1982, which was the goal, more or less, of the Israeli invasion, to do away once and for all with the Palestinians who had been attacking Israel from Lebanon. Begin, Shamir, Sharon, and other Israeli officials falsely asserted that some 2,000 Palestinian fighters and heavy weaponry remained in the city in violation of the evacuation agreement. So they were saying there were still Palestinians in there. And there's this scene that Khalidi describes where the Secretary of State, George Shultz, had accused the Israelis of deception and was demanding that Israel withdraw the last of its troops from West Beirut. Aarons responds with scorn during this meeting. "I'm not sure you guys know what you're doing," he tells Eagleberger, the Deputy Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleberger. And he called the American points a fabrication and completely false. Eagleberger then suggests that the State Department might issue a statement calling Israel's occupation of West Beirut contrary to assurances, at which point Aaron's deputy, 33-year-old Benjamin Netanyahu, weighs in. I would suggest you delete this, he said. Otherwise, you give us no choice but to defend our credibility by setting the record straight. We'll end up in a shooting war with each other. So this is Netanyahu threatening a shooting war with the United States. And then Khalidi concludes, rarely in history has a junior diplomat of a small country spoken thus to a senior representative of a superpower and been supported in doing so. Netanyahu has always seemed to get his way with the United States. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure that he gets his way always. See how many confrontations he did have with American leaders. See how President Biden has been speaking about him just this week. But it does show how things have been flipping, because if we said before that his understanding of the U.S. and ability to communicate with American audiences and American leaders was an effective added value for him at the beginning, we see how it eventually turned out to be a very confrontational approach towards those American leaders that do not agree with him. So his ability to pick up a fight with Israel's strongest ally is becoming something that he's doing time and time again in terms for improving his political standing back home. And we can take a look, of course, at what he did with President Obama during the lead up to the JCPOA, and now his confrontation with President Biden. So we see this trend happening time and time again. It's a political strategy eventually.
He seems to exert more influence in U.S. politics than any foreign leader I can think of.
I think that's for you to tell more. What we can see from Israel is how much his foreign policy approach is very personalized, meaning how much of Israel's foreign relations during the time when Netanyahu is prime minister is dictated by his personal involvement. You don't often see prime ministers and leaders so involved in such routinely events in foreign policy. Basically, one of the things that Netanyahu did in his previous times in power is disempowering the Israeli Foreign Service and taking all of the foreign policy apparatus to his domain, whether his travels, his engagement with leaders, his personal envoys that are doing the important stuff, while the professional diplomats are sidelined. So foreign policy is mostly about him. He thought he could deliver a lot on that, but it also has quite a number of downsides.
I want to stay in the 1990s here in Oslo, but one other point about this. He was invited to speak to a joint session of Congress here in the United States during the Obama years, in which he criticized the president to applause by the Republicans in Congress. That was quite a moment.
This deal has two major concessions. One, leaving Iran with a vast nuclear program. And two, lifting the restrictions on that program in about a decade. That's why this deal is so bad. It doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb. It paves Iran's path to the bomb.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has not offered any kind of viable alternative that would achieve the same verifiable mechanism to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and it was not the only time that Netanyahu was playing domestic American politics, and that's a point that is heavily criticized within Israel, because the bipartisan support of Israel within the American system was a genuine asset for Israel along the years, which multiple leaders and politicians from Israel tried to maintain. And Netanyahu clearly took sides. He clearly supported the Republican candidates for the presidency. He was clearly going after either Democratic presidents or Democratic politicians in the States. That was something that put him in a very different place than what an Israeli prime minister that cares about the alliance with the U.S. should be doing.
And hasn't Israeli politics tilted more to the right, just as some have said? Here in the United States, the right wing of the Republican Party has tilted more and more to the right.
It does tilt to the right, but still, before the previous elections in Israel, that was an issue within the campaign between the right-wing parties themselves. And there was criticism on Netanyahu from the Israeli right, not the far right, but let's say the more rational right, that says you can disagree with American leaders, but there is a way to do so. You don't pick up a public fight with the U.S. president. You sit in a room with him and you clarify things, and you fight for Israel's interests within that conversation, but the publicity and the daylight that Netanyahu really emphasized that exists between him and president. And by the way, it was not only the Democrats. If you read Barak Ravid's book on the Abraham Accords, you can see what President Trump was saying about Netanyahu during the end of his time, and that was not positive as well. So I think something basic in how he engages with the U.S. leadership is a bit flawed.
So he becomes the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations after serving as Moshe Aaron's deputy here in Washington. In the mid-1980s, he's then elected to the Israeli parliament as a member of Likud in 1988. He was deputy minister of foreign affairs from 88 to 91, then deputy prime minister under Yitzhak Shamir's coalition cabinet in the early 1990s. And in 93, he easily wins election as the leader of the Likud party. So quite a rise for Benjamin Netanyahu. You said that he was in Madrid in 91 when the seeds are planted for a peace process. But he does turn against the Oslo Accords that were struck in 1993, but really didn't agree to anything. They were supposed to set up the basis for future deliberations over these really difficult issues. Why did he turn against the Oslo Accords? And we'll get to the 1996 election where he becomes prime minister for the first time. But in these early years, what did he do to try to undermine the peace process?
Oslo Accords were important because they were a game changer in the way Israel engaged with the Palestinians and vice versa. You mentioned before Palestinian terror against Israel. In 93 on the White House lawn, you saw the PLO leader recognize Israel, recognize its right to live in security. You saw an Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, who is the Mr. Security of Israel, recognize the PLO. These are dramatic things. Before that, even to speak with a Palestinian from the PLO was against the law in Israel, and that changes. So even though...
Against the law,
you could not talk with the PLO. The PLO was a terror organization, and anyone talking with them was basically supporting terror in a way. So all those Track 2 and civil society initiatives that came to life in the late 80s, early 90s was very, very low key. And when Yitzhak Rabin and his government come into power in 92, one of the first things they do in order to legitimize the back channel talks that led to Oslo was to change this law. So you can talk with the Palestinians, it's fine, okay? And only then they can move forward towards peace. So it did reflect a change of attitude towards the PLO. And we've mentioned that Netanyahu's kind of niche was anti-terror, and Rabin and his government is changing their policies towards what was considered to be the most dangerous terror organizations acting against Israel. You can see how that played into Netanyahu's narrative and political positioning, and he found himself in the forefront of the fight against the Oslo Accords, not only, by the way, in Israel, but also using his connections in Washington, within the Jewish lobby, within AIPAC, and we saw the impact that those organizations had in trying to put all kind of stumbling blocks when Rabin was trying to advance the peace process at the time. So Netanyahu was very clear on his positions at the time.
Yeah, Rabin was not a dove, neither was Shimon Peres. None of them were. They were all soldiers from Israel's early years of existence. And I recall having watched that press conference, that event on the White House lawn in 1993, how Rabin mentioned how difficult it was to shake hands with the Palestinians, literally and figuratively, after so much blood had been spilled and so many people had their lives destroyed. They had lost relatives in terrorist attacks.
This signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principle here today, it's not so easy. Neither for myself, as a soldier in Israel's war, nor for the people of Israel, not to the Jewish people in the diaspora, who are watching us now with great hope mixed with apprehension. It is certainly not easy for the families of the victims of the wars, violence, terror, whose pain will never heal.
There was really no alternative in his view at that point. They had to give something a try. But you're saying that Netanyahu never really bought into this process.
Not at all. On the contrary, he fought it. He labeled Rabin as a traitor.
Wow,
okay?
a traitor.
Even if not saying it publicly, the protests that were happening on the streets of Israel against Rabin, against his government, with Netanyahu playing a leading role, speaking there, walking with them, turning a blind eye to the incitement against Rabin before his assassination. Many in Israel do not forget that and still hold Netanyahu accountable for enabling the environment that led to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And that was part of his fight, very clear ideological and political fight against the Oslo Accords and anything that was related to that.
In that 1996 campaign, you mentioned it. He was blamed for inciting anger against Rabin. There was a rally that was taking place, right, where people in the crowd were shouting these awful things. And then, as we know, Rabin was assassinated. I mean, in your view, as someone who studies this, I mean, how responsible was Netanyahu for what happened to Rabin?
As opposition leader at the time, instead of going to those demonstrating and shouting and threatening and attacking Rabin even before the assassination, Netanyahu had the power to try and stop that. Because Israel had heated political debates before, but nothing like that. And Netanyahu was seemingly benefiting from that. And that's how it looked at the time. Rabin himself was interviewed days before the assassination and called on Netanyahu and his role in leading this incitement. Wow. So I think there was a role at the time, and again, people still remember that in Israel.
He was assassinated by an Israeli, or I should say a Jewish religious student. That ideology, while it existed in society on the margins, had not entered the mainstream of political life yet.
No, I think that the ideology of Yigal Amir, the one who assassinated Rabin, was never entered in the mainstream, because that's the utmost level of political violence. The hope was that after that happened, then there will be an understanding of what these incitements and polarized and divisive messaging can lead to. But unfortunately, we didn't learn that, and we see it play out until today in the Israeli political scene.
As a distant observer of all of this, Netanyahu himself never struck me as a fanatic. But as you say, he catered or cozied up to these ideas for political purposes.
And there you see a gap between how they play politics and how you do policy. Okay? And in terms of getting to political power and preserving political power, Netanyahu was divisive from day one. Okay? Because Netanyahu came to power in mid-96 in elections that were early elections called by Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres replaced Yitzhak Rabin as the prime minister after the assassination. He was in power for about half a year, and then went to election with an enormous advantage over Netanyahu that was basically unknown on the national level. But the campaign of Netanyahu in 96 was so divisive, and that line of action in his political career continues ever since. But when it comes to the policy, I think, and that's a change from Netanyahu of today to Netanyahu, which we saw in the past, he was kind of cautious of any military adventures and was willing to play pragmatically at times and cater to what the Americans wanted him to say, while sometimes doing exactly the opposite, but knowing how to play this public domain of diplomacy to reassure people that he's not this fanatic that you mentioned, while on the side of things sometimes doing quite contrary issues.
So he wins the 96 election, and as William Cleveland writes in his book, A History of the Modern Middle East, he formed a coalition government, and this is in 96, called one of the most conservative and religiously oriented in the history of Israel. It was also one of the most inept. During its first 2.5 years in office, it lurched from one self-induced crisis to another, barely managing to survive. In his need to conciliate the religious and nationalist elements upon which his coalition government depended, Netanyahu adopted hardline policies toward the occupied territories. He refused to acknowledge any connection between land and peace, assuring Israelis that they could have security, settlements, and peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians. And Cleveland goes on to write, he inaugurated a new round of provocative settlement activities, initiating the construction of new settlements and expanding existing ones that seemed to invite Palestinian retaliation. As many as 5,000 housing units were under construction in the West Bank in 1997. And the most controversial of these projects was the start of a large settlement project in Arab East Jerusalem in violation of the Oslo Accords. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, so the settlements, again, was not only a Netanyahu thing. And I think a lot of the discourse puts on Netanyahu things that are much larger in Israeli politics. We see it also today. Yes, Netanyahu was going all out against Oslo. Netanyahu was causing security problems for Israel at that time. There was a failed assassination of Khalid Mashal of Hamas in Jordan that Israel paid the price for at the time. There was all kind of irresponsible actions inside the old city in Jerusalem near the mosque that led to riots. So there was a lot of security instability caused by things that he was doing. There were terror attacks, but Netanyahu always tried to play in between. And he was meeting Yasser Arafat in 1998 together with the American president. They were meeting and shaking hands and talking together and signing agreements.
For 17 months, the Middle East peace process has been stalled, placing in jeopardy all that Israelis and Palestinians have achieved together since the Oslo Accords. This week's talk at Y River offered the chance for the parties to break the logjam and finally take the next essential steps for peace in the Middle East.
Any movement to give them additional land is premised on their fighting terrorism, as I said, in word and in deed. And if they do so, then we have an ability to move forward. But understand my concern. Israel is a tiny country. We're asked to give large lots of land right next to our cities, right next to our White House, right next to our capital, right next to our major cities. How do we know that these areas, these territories, do not become bases of terrorism?
Again, it's this kind of dual playing in a way, that on one hand you carry out these actions that go and undermine the basic essence of the peace process, but he never cancelled Oslo, he never cancelled the accord, and he goes to meet with Yasser Arafat, who is portraying as the arch enemy of Israel ever, and the largest terrorist that Israel confronted. The government did not work, it failed, it lost the belief of the public, and then when Ehud Barak comes to contend, he wins big time and takes Netanyahu out of office.
Now, you mentioned the Y River Accords in '98 when he came here to the United States and signed that agreement. I think that was for further withdrawals of the Israeli military from the West Bank, right? Hebron and some other places as well. But hasn't Netanyahu, the abiding idea of his political career is land for peace doesn't work, that Israel has nothing to gain by withdrawing from the West Bank because it just makes Israel's enemies closer to Israel?
So Netanyahu began with the anti-terror discourse that we mentioned. Then he took the goal of preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. It's something that he is claiming for until today. So anything that would bring the Palestinians closer to a state will be something that he would actively oppose. Then he would play the Iran card, so being the one that could confront the Iran nuclear program. And later on, he will turn to Mr. Normalization. So he will be the one that will enable Israel to have ties with Arab countries by sidelining the Palestinian issue. So that is kind of the evolution of his political positioning or diplomatic positioning along the years.
There was a telling moment in 2011, speaking of Netanyahu's political skill. He's meeting at the White House with President Obama, and he says he's not necessarily against the peace process. It's that Israel will not go back to its pre-1967 borders, because at one point Israel was no wider than the Capital Beltway, and that is something any American can envision.
What we all want is a peace that will be genuine, that will hold, that will endure. And I think that we both agree that a peace based on illusions will crash eventually on the rocks of Middle Eastern reality. And that the only peace that will endure is one that is based on reality, on unshakable facts. I think for there to be peace, the Palestinians will have to accept some basic realities. The first is that while Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines, because these lines are indefensible, because they don't take into account certain changes that have taken place on the ground, demographic changes that have taken place over the last 44 years. Remember that before 1967, Israel was all of 9 miles wide. It was half the width of the Washington Beltway. And these were not the boundaries of peace. They were the boundaries of repeated wars, because the attack on Israel was so attractive from them.
Yeah, there was also what was called the Bar Ilan speech, in which he spoke, the most favorably ever spoke about the concept of a Palestinian state or a two-state solution. So it's the same tactic of giving something to appease international pressure. Netanyahu wanted not to face international pressure on the Palestinian issue. That's why he played along with John Kerry during the 2013-14 peace talks, although he never had the intention to move that forward. In terms of how he defined Palestinian sovereignty, he once used the term of Andorra, like a model like the semi-state of Andorra, or whatever you define it, of having the Palestinians some sort of self-control, but in a way that is very distant than what people perceive when they speak about a state with military capacity and full governing capacity. So it does not necessarily seem to want Israeli annexation and full control over the Palestinians themselves, but definitely doesn't aspire to have a Palestinian state as the international community sees that.
Netanyahu, as you said, loses power in 1999. He returns to the prime ministership in 2009, and this is where he does his campaign against Iran.
And as long as Iran persists in its dangerous quest for nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, we shouldn't go back to business as usual with Iran. But evidently, giving Iran's murderous regime a clear path to the bomb is negotiable. This is unconscionable. Iran's regime is as radical as ever. Its cries of death to America, that same America that it calls the great Satan, as loud as ever. They're at war with us. We never sought any enmity with Iran. They openly declare that their goal is to annihilate us every day. Nothing could imperil our common future more than the arming of Iran with nuclear weapons.
Do you agree with Trita Parsi's analysis that Bibi turned his focus to demonizing Iran because he was afraid that if the United States and Iran developed a less hostile relationship and came to an agreement, for example, on the nuclear issue, then that would make the U.S.-Israeli relationship less important and the U.S. would need Israel less than it had before?
I don't think so. I don't think it's an American centrist position that guided Netanyahu. It was mostly how we saw Iran, not how we saw the States. I think the understanding that the Israel-American alliance is a strong one and will continue, and Iran is not a replacement for Israel in terms of the American security calculation, but the fear that he saw in Iran going nuclear was something that was very clear in his political messaging all along, coming from that very basic essence of anti-terror. And he was positioning himself as Mr. Security at the time. He will be the one who will save the Jewish people from the threat of annihilation by a nuclear Iran. And that was the story. It was kind of a grandiose positioning of his role within Jewish history, which many people related to his father, the historian of the Jewish people, and the clear ideological Jabotinsky. So Netanyahu was the savior of the public as he wanted to be seen, and the way to save the Israeli security and people, from his point of view, was to play the Iranian card, and of course it also was a domestic political tool. So he believed in ideology. I think he definitely was on message with what he said. He really believed that, but he also understood that that is a card that he could play for his domestic political gains.
He had to know that at some point Iran had given up trying to build a nuclear missile. Iran is a nuclear-capable state, but it hasn't decided to build a bomb, and he's known that, hasn't he?
The fear in Israel that Iran is trying, that Iran will reach a point in which the breakout will be a very quick one. So even if it's not going all the way now, it could reach a situation in which the gap to make it happen was very near. And during his first years in power after he came back in 2009, that was years in which Ehud Barak was part of his coalition, there were indications that he actually thinks about attacking Iran unilaterally. Okay, and there was a concern in Washington as well about a possible Israeli action that will go after the Iran nuclear project, and I think Netanyahu did not do that eventually, partly because there was so much opposition within the Israeli security establishment on that, and probably coming also from Washington, but it also reflects this reluctance of going into military adventures that you don't know what will happen with at the end.
So the mowing the lawn strategy, this is the idea that you can keep 2 million Palestinians in Gaza under a blockade, and there will be periodic outbreaks of violence, and then you go back to this uneasy modus vivendi. And then a couple of years later, there's another outbreak of violence. You have to go back. For instance, the 2014 war in Gaza was particularly destructive. This whole cycle blew up in Israel's face on October 7th. If what you're saying about Netanyahu, that his idea that he would be the man to give Israel security, settlements, and a coexistence with the Palestinians that never leads to Palestinian statehood, this idea is in tatters now, and therefore isn't Netanyahu's legacy in tatters?
This idea failed because when Netanyahu tried to pursue this idea, it also included maintaining a divide between Palestinians, between the West Bank and Gaza. Netanyahu thought that if the divide that happened in 2007 when Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority, Netanyahu thought that plays into Israeli interest because as long as the Palestinians are divided, you cannot have a Palestinian state even if Israel wants to, because there is internal division. So he was trying to play those divisions and basically was empowering Hamas. Netanyahu was allowing money, lots of money, to go into Hamas to maintain Hamas positioning and power within the Gaza Strip.
From Qatar and other places, right?
Exactly, and he was going on record saying, these things. And this is the policy that people are now seeing the outcomes of. And people do not trust the leader who led to this position, who brought Hamas into a situation in which it can do what it did in October 7. And Netanyahu's legacy that was supposed to be anti-terror is now October 7.
So maybe that's why he believes Hamas can be completely defeated. It's one way of repairing his legacy.
I think that's something that is shared by many Israelis, not only Netanyahu supporters. They need to defeat militarily. Again, not wipe out the organization, because that's an ideological organization that you cannot wipe an idea, but at least ensure that the military capacity of Hamas will not be there anymore. In order to leverage that towards peace, you need to agree to things that Netanyahu opposes. Basically empowering the Palestinian Authority, enabling the Palestinian Authority to go back to Gaza, move towards a two-state solution. That's all of the things that Netanyahu does not want to do, and therefore if you talk about the day after the current war and about pro-peace progress, you really need to think about a different type of Israeli leadership that is more open to such ideas. Netanyahu isn't and will not be.
And put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own. Living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day. It's not just when settler violence against Palestinians goes unpunished. It's not right to prevent Palestinians from farming their lands or restricting a student's ability to move around the West Bank or displace Palestinian families from their homes. Neither occupation nor expulsion is the answer.
That was Barack Obama delivering a speech in Jerusalem during his presidency, words that could have been delivered at any time after 1967. On the next episode of History as It Happens, actually on upcoming episodes, we're going to take a look at the anarchy in Haiti, and also the life and politics of Eugene V. Debs, American socialist, who may be best remembered for running for president from prison. That's coming up on History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.